There was a rumor that the world was born in love, before the stars were clothed in fire. A silver thread drawn forth from darkness, a spark of light announced the blaze. An endless void at last surrendered, and at first, the first of days. In gilded panoply arose flaming cherubim, lords of stars, form without matter, thought without weight, descending the ladder to the humblest of paths. And then divine touched flesh, touched sight, the race of man, brought forth from clod, with hand and mind to rule the realm, and soul to see the face of God. But void still raged to claim its child, that ancient bent and stiffened neck, and through deceit and crooked tongue bound up man's gifted breath. Thus the sons of Adam fell to Tartarus' shallow graves, to wait upon the dying flame when all return from whence they came. But long before the cosmos danced, or ere God set the skies ablaze, there was love, all in all, God from God, the Word proclaimed. Weaving flesh and soul and bone, the Word assumed man's wounded frame, to draw the deadly poison out and carry sin's unlawful claim. But death would forge the sword to strike, the shining heel of heaven's sun. That ancient wound, infected still, inflicted on the Holy One. Yet sin, for all its boasts and lies, bereft of power, was trampled down. For darkness cannot overcome the fire of salvation's crown. Creation groaning in decay rose up anew, alive, reborn. The Word who called life from the deep broke the shame forevermore. There was a rumor that the world was born in love, a whisper spoken true, the Word, the life, the risen one, remaking all things new.
D.L. Moody once said, "A scarlet thread running all through the Bible, the whole book points to Christ." The Bible is a collection of 66 individual books written by 40 different authors across 3 different continents in 3 different languages over a span of 1,500 years. It was penned by kings and peasants, those who were educated and uneducated, public officials and farmers, teachers and physicians, writing from prisons, palaces, cities, dungeons, the wilderness, and at least one remote island. Yet altogether, these 66 books tell the singular most powerful story in all of human history, the story of Jesus Christ and the redemption of mankind. It is a story without equal and one that every single one of us is a part of. You understand, without his story, you don't have a story. All of your dreams, all of your plans, everything you enjoy in this life, and all that you have to look forward to only exists because of this story, because of his story. It all hinges on him. Without Jesus, there's nothing to enjoy today and nothing to work toward tomorrow. We have no life or breath without him, because without Jesus, none of this exists. Luke records the Apostle Paul addressing a group of pagan philosophers, the greatest secular minds of the day at the Areopagus, the ruling court in Athens in the 1st century AD. And in his address to these brilliant thinkers, Paul quotes a poem from 600 BC. It was written by a man named Epimenides of Crete. It was a poem about the Greek god Zeus, which says, Paul is quoting the poem, he says, "In him we live and move and have our being." Acts 17:28. That was from a poem written about Zeus, but Paul quotes it in Acts 17, of course, applying this quote from one of their own pagan poems to refer to Jesus Christ. He was saying to these spectacularly brilliant and yet utterly lost men, you have the right idea, but the wrong person. Because without Jesus Christ, even the mortal mind who dreamed up the very idea of Zeus wouldn't exist. To the church in Corinth, he said, "For us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist." 1 Corinthians 8:6. To the church at Colossae, he said, "For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he's before all things, and in him all things hold together." Colossians 1:16 and 17. The author of Hebrews wrote, "He upholds the universe by the word of his power." Hebrews 1:3. King David wrote, "You open your hand, you satisfy the desire of every living thing." Psalm 145:16. While the Apostle John wrote, "All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men." John 1:3 and 4. The NIV says it this way, "In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind." Not just the light of the portion of mankind that happens to believe in him. No, his life is the light of all mankind. Why? Because without Jesus, nothing exists. So you understand, this story about him is not just a story in the history of the world or one of the more well-known stories in the human record. No, the story of Jesus is the story that all other stories exist because of, including your story. Which means as we go on about our lives, we really need to stop trying to figure out how Jesus fits into our story and start trying to figure out how we fit into his story. Because whether we like it or not, we're living in his story. Yet it's so easy to lose sight of that for different reasons, which we're going to see in this portion of his story that we're studying today as we continue our sermon series, working our way through the gospel according to Mark, where we find these people back then, just as we do today, trying to write their own stories independent of his. And what happens when you do that is you become disconnected from the very thing your entire story depends upon. It's sort of like commissioning a great work of art without the painter, right? You can purchase the very best canvas, the very best brushes, the very best paint, the very best easel, and then place it all just perfectly before the very best landscape, but without the painter, all you're ever going to have is a blank canvas and a lot of wasted supplies. Okay, your life is a blank canvas that Jesus wants to paint a masterpiece on. But when you fail to give all those resources and the canvas itself to the painter, in the end, it all amounts to an incomplete picture at best or an empty canvas at worst. Yet when you recognize that your life is the canvas that he's painting his story on, and that each new day, every decision, every relationship, every action of your life is but another brush stroke of the Creator painting his masterpiece, then these life moments, things like buying houses, becomes far less about how many bedrooms and bathrooms it has, less about the neighborhood it's in, and far more about how does my family living in that house fit into the gospel story I'm living in. Right? Taking a new job becomes less about the income and position and far more about how that job fits into the gospel story that you're living in. Who you marry, where you go, what you do. When you recognize that you're living in his story, and so you give all that to him to work with, well, then your daily decisions take on a whole new dimension, a whole new purpose, and that's when you see the story of your life really begin to take shape and to make sense, which we're going to see today as we pick the story back up where we left off last time. So let's read it together and see what we can learn about living in his story. We'll begin at Mark chapter 8 and read the first 13 verses. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away. And his disciples answered him, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And then they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full, and there were about 4,000 people. And he sent them away, and immediately got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. So Mark starts out the story with in those days, which means he's continuing his story from the last chapter, which ended with Jesus healing a deaf and mute man in the Gentile region of the Decapolis on the eastern side of the lake, which means they're still in that region, further confirmed by the fact that Jesus describes some of the people as having come from far away, as the region of Decapolis was not only a rugged area geographically, but it had far fewer towns and villages than the west side of the lake, which meant it would be a perilous journey, to say the least, for many of them to have to go back home without any food. As Jesus points out, they've been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they'll faint on the way, which wouldn't so much be the case on the western side of the lake. So out of great compassion, Jesus performs another large-scale miracle to a group of Gentiles, much like the one he performed for a group of Jews back in chapter 6, where we saw Jesus feeding 5,000 men with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, although that was, not to be mistaken, a much larger crowd than this one, according to Mark, where in the first event, you'll remember if you were here, he uses the Greek word for men that is gender specific, meaning the count of the 5,000 men did not include women and children. So we estimate about 20,000 people in total in that event, whereas Mark here simply describes the crowd as 4,000 people, implying that women and children are included in that count in the story. Of course, none of that makes this miracle any less miraculous, right? Or any less curious. That the disciples seem baffled at how they're going to provide food for 4,000 people with 7 loaves of bread and some fish, after just having fed far more people with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish in the very recent past. But the reason why will actually become clear as we get a little deeper into the story. And interestingly, there was also great prophetic significance between these two mass feedings. When Jesus fed the large crowd of Jews back in chapter 6, he prayed according to Jewish custom as described by the Greek word eulogeo in chapter 6, verse 41, where here in chapter 8, he uses the Gentile Christian form of blessing Eucharisto, which of course is where we get the English word Eucharist from, which we use to describe today the Lord's Supper or Holy Communion. And yet, even more compelling is the fact that at the end of the Jewish feeding miracle, there were 12 basketfuls of food left over, just as there were 12 tribes of Israel. And after this Gentile feeding, there are 7 basketfuls of food left over, just as there were 7 Gentile nations in Canaan. The Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, pointing to the fact, of course, that the bread of life that Jesus is bringing to the world, it was not just for all the Jews, but for all the Gentiles as well. So can you begin to see how in the places Jesus and his disciples go, in the conversations they have, in the very words they speak, in fact, even in the leftover food that they eat, Jesus' story, the gospel story, is being told through it all over and over and over again. Truly, we're living in his story. So Jesus and his disciples get back into the boat and cross over the lake back to the western or Jewish side, where he's promptly confronted by the Pharisees who came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And if you read that in the ancient Greek, you'll find that the description of the Pharisees testing Jesus is actually far too weak of a translation. The original language paints this confrontation as the equivalent of the Pharisees putting Jesus on trial maliciously. They're so openly hostile toward him at this point, they're trying to berate him into submission. The fact is, they'd already seen him perform countless signs and miracles, which they already attributed to the power of Satan working through Jesus, which we saw back in chapter 3, verse 22. Okay, the truth is, these guys aren't the least bit interested in seeing a sign to prove Jesus is who he claimed to be. No, they want submission. The Pharisees didn't want to know Jesus. They wanted to control Jesus because they didn't like where his story was going. But like it or not, this was his story, and the Pharisees could not control it. Of course, it's easy for us today to sort of look down our noses at these religious Jews who were seeking a sign from Jesus for their own purposes. But honestly, how often do we seek a sign from Jesus today for our own purposes? Listen, it's not wrong to ask him for something in your life. In fact, we're instructed in Scripture to do just that. It's what drives those requests that matters. Are you asking because you want to see his story unfold in your life, or are you merely trying to fulfill a personal desire, something that serves your own purposes? Because listen, if it's the latter, whether you realize it or not, you're trying to control the story just like the Pharisees were. It's why the Apostle John said this is the confidence we have toward him, that if we ask anything, what? According to his will, he hears us. 1 John 5:14, according to his will. In other words, according to his story. It's asking on his terms, not ours, which is the only way you'll ever get anywhere with Jesus, by the way. When we demand something from God to suit our own personal desires, we're trying to control the story, to make him act on our terms instead of us submitting to him on his terms. And as we'll see in the story today, that approach isn't going to get you anywhere with God. Okay, look, the truth is, if we truly submitted all of our decisions, even just the big decisions, if we truly submitted all of our decisions to the will of Christ before making those decisions, I dare say most of our lives would look drastically different than they do today. If we actually submitted every aspect of ourselves to Christ, our lives would be so radical, the world wouldn't know what to do with us today, just as it didn't know what to do with Jesus then. Because in the first century, you understand, there was no such thing as casual Christianity. And if there had been, the Pharisees wouldn't have even bothered to notice it. As Pastor John Rice once said, the world never burned a casual Christian at the stake. But in our modern church culture, we've elevated and promoted a gospel that promises almost everything for us while expecting almost nothing from us. I'm telling you, we've bought it hook, line, and sinker, which is evidenced by the fact that so much of the modern church has proven itself powerless to effect meaningful change in our culture, let alone in the rest of the world in our lifetime. Why? Because we're more enamored with our story than we are with his. Think about it, honestly. If you spend more time on social media promoting what you're doing rather than what God is doing, whose story are you living for? If the bulk of your time is spent doing what you want without first asking God what he wants, whose story are you living for? If investing yourself into the lifeblood of the local church is something you do as long as you're feeling good and don't dislike anyone there and agree with everything the pastor says and don't have anything else you'd rather be doing that day, whose story are you living for? Man, I'll tell you, through this storm, I've been thinking about, what if we turned off the air conditioning, took away the soft chairs, the cool music, the hot coffee? You had to walk to a church service that lasted all day in the heat of the summer or the dead of winter. Would you still come? Would you still come like they do in other parts of the world? And if the honest answer is probably not, then whose story are you living for? Look, I know that's a hard question, but But I think it's a necessary question given the state of the modern Western church today that promises so much and yet expects so little because we're trying to control the story. Why? In order to make it more palatable for a culture that is increasingly hostile to the gospel and to bring it more in line with our comfortable lifestyle. But look, we can't control his story any more than the Pharisees could, because whether we like it or not, we're living in his story, and it's a story that's already been written. Which means no matter how hard you try, you cannot fit Jesus into your narrative, into your story. No, the best you can do is to do all that you can do to fit your life into his story. And the payoff in this life is you get to watch him make a masterpiece out of everything you give him. Let's keep reading, verses 14 through 26. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you take up? Like 8 minutes ago." They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000. How many basketfuls of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led them out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes, he laid his hands on him and asked him, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Don't even enter the village." So the Pharisees get nowhere with Jesus by trying to control him as he refuses their demand for a sign, gets into the boat, and goes back to the other side of the lake. And on the way, Jesus tries to make the most of their time by teaching the disciples something useful based on the interaction they just had with the Pharisees. So he says, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." Leaven is yeast that ferments, causing dough to rise when you're making bread. In ancient rabbinic literature, leaven as a metaphor was nearly always used in a negative sense. Likewise, in the New Testament, with only one exception, leaven is always used to allude to corruption or unholiness or danger. And in Matthew and Luke's accounts of this same story, the leaven is related to the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and their teachings. And what is so frightening about that is the fact that Jesus is warning the disciples, his own disciples, of their own susceptibility to the leaven of the Pharisees. Think about that. These men who are with Jesus all day, every day, according to Jesus, are at grave risk of becoming as hard-hearted as the Pharisees, which is not only proven by his own family throughout this gospel and by Judas at the end of Jesus' life on earth, but it's proven in just the next few verses as it becomes evident that these men who are the closest to Jesus, who've seen all the miracles and heard all the teaching and received all of his blessings, are completely clueless about the gospel that Jesus is living out right in front of them. They think he's referring to their lack of bread in the boat right after he just got done feeding 4,000 hungry people with 7 loaves of bread and a few fish. So Jesus, incredulous at their lack of understanding, peppers them with questions. Hey, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember what just happened? Seriously, guys, I just fed 4,000 people right in front of you. Did you forget about that already? Do you think I'm worried about our lack of bread? Did you not see what I just did? Can you not hear me? Are you not listening at all to what I'm trying to teach you? Are your hearts so hard that you still don't know who I am or what I've come to do? Right after this tongue lashing by Jesus, and that's what it was, they land on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee and come to Bethsaida, where Jesus seizes an opportunity to show his disciples exactly what he's talking about, because clearly they're not getting it. And the people there then bring him a blind man for healing. And Jesus leads them away from the people so that he can demonstrate for these 12, without the distraction of the crowds, their own blindness to the truth about Jesus, which also explains this two-stage healing of the blind man, which, by the way, had nothing to do with an inability of Jesus to heal him on the first try. On the contrary, it had everything to do with Jesus demonstrating in a tangible way the progression of revelation that the disciples have to experience if they're ever going to be able to see clearly with their own spiritual eyes. So Jesus spits on the man's eyes. By the way, that was a fairly well-known treatment for blindness in the ancient Near East at the time, believe it or not. In fact, Tacitus, the great Roman historian, records a story of the Roman Emperor Vespasian spitting on a blind man's eyes and cheeks in order to restore his sight, which, according to the record, worked at least to some degree. And so, as strange as it sounds to us, Jesus was actually doing something that was an acceptable treatment for blindness at the time. No doubt after many others had already tried and failed on this same man, and yet the method was not the point. It was the progression of the man's healing. As Jesus spits on the man's eyes and lays hands on him, and then he asks him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Again, this response was for the benefit of the disciples who believed in Jesus, but they still couldn't fully perceive who he was or what he'd come to do. It was as if they saw him, but only partially, just like the blind man's partially restored vision. So Jesus lays his hands on his eyes again, opens his eyes, his sight is restored, and he sees everything clearly, which was not only the restoration of physical sight for this man, but it was also a prophetic glimpse into the beginning of the restoration of the spiritual sight for these disciples, as we're going to see in the last part of the story today in just a few minutes. And so just as the Pharisees could not control the story that was unfolding through Jesus, the disciples could not see it. Up to this point, they could not fully see Jesus for who he was or what he was there to accomplish. In fact, the full revelation of the Christ to these men was a progressive one throughout the gospel story, with, of course, several watershed moments along the way, like the calming of the storm in chapter 4, when he walks on water in chapter 6, Peter's confession, as we'll see today, the transfiguration, which we'll see next week, the crucifixion at the end of Jesus' life on earth. And yet it was ultimately not until his resurrection and ascension that the revelation of the Christ came into fullness for these disciples, as their understanding was yet incomplete, which raises a point of profound importance for every believer today. If you get nothing else out of this today, please listen. Because back on the boat, Jesus wasn't warning the disciples about their hearts becoming hardened due to a lack of faith. No. He was warning them that their hearts would become hardened due to a lack of understanding, which is precisely the problem plaguing the church today in epic proportions. A deep poverty of biblical literacy, a tremendous lack of biblical understanding among believing Christians, which is why, by the way, I'm so passionate and adamant about adding on to these buildings so that we can have a proper Christian education department dedicated to teaching the whole counsel of God, all of God's word to his people systematically beyond these Sunday sermons. Because, listen, even with all the information available to us at our fingertips in this technological age that we're living in, biblical illiteracy is at an all-time high in the church. And the result is not only members of the church, but leaders of the church leaving the fellowship and the faith, as we've seen just recently in some high-profile cases where a clear lack of understanding, a lack of depth has led to a hardening of the heart toward Christ and his body. This is the dangers of shallow preachers and shallow preaching. Bible scholar James Edwards said, "Failure to understand leads to hardness of heart. The plea for understanding is a reminder that faith is not separate from understanding, but only possible through understanding." Okay, faith without understanding is a shallow faith at best, and over time, it breeds hard hearts, which was proven time and again by his own disciples and has been proven over and over again in the church ever since. So look, you can believe in Jesus. In fact, you can even walk with him at some level of obedience for years, but you understand it is possible to do that and still be more focused on your own story than you are on his, which is exactly what was happening with these disciples. They're with Jesus day in and day out. They're doing what he tells them to do, and yet just by listening in on their conversations about food from day to day, it becomes quite clear that they're more focused on themselves still than they were on Jesus. And the result was a deep lack of understanding about who he was and what he was there to do. And as Mark tells us at points along the way, as a result, their hearts were hardened. I mean, but honestly, isn't this exactly what we do today? We believe in Jesus. We get involved in church. We teach our kids to do the same. We seemingly live good Christian lives, but in reality, I think most of us are far from more focused on our own story than we are on his. You put me in that boat often. It's so easy to become so much more focused on our own story than we are on his. Precisely how you end up with churches full of people who believe in Jesus but lack any depth of understanding about who he actually is and what he actually came to do. And listen, without that understanding, your heart is openly susceptible to hardening over time because, as most of you already well know, this life will inevitably, at points along the way, present some deeply difficult questions that faith without understanding will struggle to answer. Talking about questions about God, about life, about loss, and the meaning of all of it. And listen, the time when you need understanding the most is when things are at their worst, which is also when people tend to walk away from the faith, when things don't turn out the way they thought they should, when the prayers didn't get answered the way they wanted them to, when God didn't show up the way they believed he would, and all of a sudden there's a crisis of faith born out of a lack of understanding of who God is and what his purposes actually are in this world in the midst of those difficult circumstances. This is what happens when we're unwilling to go deep with God and his word, which again is it's when you're more focused on your own story is when that happens, when you're more concerned about yourself, your story, your life, your preferences, your desires, your feelings than you are with what God wants. You go deep into your own life, your own things, and neglect his. A simple faith in Christ is the right place to start. But if you've been a Christian for any length of time and you're still relying on that simple faith without any depth of understanding of the story in these 66 books to sustain you through life, you will undoubtedly struggle to maintain a tender heart toward Christ and his people when life applies significant amounts of pressure to your simple faith. And we all know it will. Okay? So how do I move on from a simple faith? Well, for starters, you have to recognize and accept that this isn't your story to begin with. This isn't all about you. This isn't all about me. The universe doesn't revolve around me. This is his story. You're living in his story, which means the only way to truly understand what's happening in the story that you're living in and why is to focus on him instead of yourself. The disciples couldn't understand the story they were living in, yet because they're still focused on themselves instead of Jesus, and nothing has changed in that regard for us today. Until you learn to take your focus off of yourself and your story and put it squarely on Jesus and his story, his word, his church, all of the things he gave us to learn to live in his story. Until you do that, you will always lack understanding, which will eventually harden your heart toward him and his people. Look, I've seen this firsthand over and over and over and over again. In fact, I have friends today who post the most vile things about God, about Jesus, on social media. I'm talking about people who were once leaders, even staff members at churches, pastors. But because their faith, their understanding of the faith was an inch deep and a mile wide, There was an indifference to even want to understand more. It was all about how I feel. My life, what God's doing in me, who I am to other people. Shallow understanding. Because of it, their hearts were hardened and they turned away from God. The moment trouble showed up. It happens all the time, typically not all at once. It's usually a gradual hardening of the heart. And if you pay attention at all, I'm telling you, you can see it happen in other believers' lives. Professing believers who are so consumed with everything happening in their own story, everything's about me, they fail to pay attention to the masterpiece that God is trying to paint for them. And so they neglect time with Him. They neglect His Word. They neglect His church. They neglect the work that He's trying to do in their lives. And I'm telling you, if you pay attention at all, you can see it happening as they drift further and further away from the body of Christ and from Christ Himself. Until one day they stop showing up as frequently, then they stop showing up at all, only to find out later that they've walked away from the faith and the church altogether. I've seen it more times than I care to remember. The hardening of the heart because of a deep lack of understanding. It always begins, always, when you're more focused on your own story than you are in His. In fact, I'll tell you something. I have yet to ever, in 30 years of church ministry, I have yet to even once talk to someone whose heart was hardened toward the church and ultimately walked away. I've yet to have a conversation with one of those folks who wasn't utterly focused on themselves. When you talk to them about why they left the faith, why they left the church, why they don't believe anymore, why they don't follow Christ anymore, it's always 100% of the time about me. What happened to me? Who hurt me? What's going on with me? How things didn't go my way? How it didn't turn out how I thought it would? How He didn't do what I wanted Him to? How He didn't write my story the way I told Him to? It's what they're saying without saying it. They neglect time with Him. They neglect His Word. They neglect His church. And their hearts eventually harden toward all of it, which is what inevitably happens when you focus on your story instead of His. You lack understanding of His story, the story that you're actually living in. And without that understanding, your heart hardens over time, because otherwise, listen, this life makes no sense. It makes no sense when you can't see the masterpiece that He's painting, which is the real tragedy, by the way, of people who walk away from the faith. The untold number of masterpieces that never get painted because we're too focused on ourselves to recognize the master painter at work. Let's finish the story for today, verse 27 to the end of the chapter. And Jesus went on with His disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, He asked His disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told Him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered Him, "You're the Christ." And He strictly charged them to tell no one about Him. And He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said this plainly. Peter took Him aside and began to rebuke Him. But turning and seeing His disciples, He rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Calling the crowd to Him with His disciples, He said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when He comes in the glory of His Father with the holy angels." So from Bethsaida, Jesus and His disciples traveled north about 25 miles to Caesarea Philippi. And on the way there, Jesus asks them a question that previously they wouldn't have been able to answer. After asking them what people were saying about His identity, He asks His disciples directly the very question they've been asking each other ever since Jesus calmed the wind and the waves. If you'll remember back in chapter 4, verse 41, when they looked at each other with great fear and amazement, and they posed the question, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey Him?" Yet from then to now, much has happened as Jesus continues to teach them to turn their focus on him right up to this two-stage healing of the blind man. And now the time has come for Jesus to ask them directly, who do you say that I am? And without any discussion or hesitation, Peter says plainly, you're the Christ. Finally, after all the teaching, all the miracles, all the long days and troubled nights watching Jesus overcome everything from religious authorities out to kill him, to life-threatening storms, to legions of demons, finally, the disciples understand who Jesus actually is, which is the first part of the story they needed to grasp, to understand. It's the second part of the story they still haven't fully grasped and won't until after the resurrection, the part about what Jesus actually came here to do, which is evident immediately after Peter's bold revelation of Jesus' true identity as Jesus begins to teach them for the first time his mission, the full story of why he came and how that story was going to unfold, namely through suffering, rejection, crucifixion, and then resurrection. Now, imagine you're a disciple. After all you've given up to follow Jesus, after all you've been through with him ever since, and after being harshly rebuked by him repeatedly for not understanding, finally it clicks, and you realize just exactly who it is you're following. This is a watershed moment for these disciples, and yet immediately after you discover that Jesus is the Christ, he tells you he's going to suffer and die at the hands of their fellow countrymen. I mean, it's not really hard to understand Peter's reaction. So overcome with emotion was Peter in that moment that he lost his self-control, allowing the enemy to directly influence his response. In Luke's gospel, when he describes Satan's temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, as R.C. Sproul put it, the very heart of this temptation was the acquisition of a throne without the experience of pain and suffering. In other words, Satan was trying to convince Jesus that he could rule as a king without having to suffer. Of course, Jesus knew what he'd come to this earth to do, and he knew that that would necessitate suffering, so he resisted Satan and the suggestion that Jesus could somehow live out his story without suffering. Now, Luke says, when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time. Luke 4:13, until an opportune time. Well, guess what? That opportune time had just come. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. The English word rebuke that Peter describes Peter's reaction here, by the way, hardly does justice to Peter's actual response. This was not merely a disagreement or Peter simply trying to correct Jesus. No, the actual word that Mark uses to describe Peter's rebuke of Jesus is the exact same ancient Greek word that Jesus uses to rebuke the demons throughout the gospel. This is a hostile attempt by Peter, or more accurately by the enemy through Peter, to take control of the story by telling Jesus that the very thing Jesus said must happen most certainly would never happen. It's just the same thing he said to Jesus before in the wilderness. You can have all this without suffering, Jesus. So Jesus responds, not just to Peter, but to the spirit of Satan working in Peter in that moment. Get behind me, Satan. We've had this conversation already. You're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And then he goes on to teach them that, in fact, not only would he have to suffer, but anyone who chooses to follow him would also have to suffer. Yet as difficult as that must have been to hear, look at how Jesus ends the teaching. Whoever's ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man also must be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. In other words, although the story involves suffering, it doesn't end in suffering. No, the story ends in victory, and no power on earth, no power in heaven above or hell below could keep him from living out this story that ends in his total victory. The Pharisees could not control it. The disciples could not yet see it. And the world could not stop it. What Jesus said was going to happen was going to happen. No matter how many people would ever choose to embrace his story or reject it, nothing in this world could stop Jesus from completing the story that is his gospel. which is in fact the only reason we're even able to exist in the world at all. But listen, it goes so far beyond the wonder of simply existing, because a major part of his story is the masterpiece he's creating that is your life. And nothing in this world can stop him from completing that masterpiece. Nothing that is, of course, that's right, except you. You see, whether it's a desire to control the story, which I think we all struggle with at times, I certainly do, or lack of understanding about who he is or what he's actually trying to do in our lives when we go through especially difficult circumstances, whatever the reason, we get so focused on ourselves that we forget whose story it is we're actually living in. So look, I'm just here to remind you today, it's his story. Always has been, always will be. And nothing in this world can stop that from being true. Doesn't it make sense then that as we go on about our lives, doesn't it make sense that we stop trying to figure out how to fit Jesus into our story and instead focus on how we fit into his? Because it is his story. I mean, don't you want to see what he can do with your life? When you're fully submitted to him, I mean, don't you want to see the masterpiece completed? You're the only person who can keep that from happening by focusing on yourself instead of him. But you know what? Even at that, it's still his story. Whether you accept it or reject it, whether you believe it or not, whether you allow him to paint your masterpiece, or you choose instead to focus on whatever picture you're trying to paint for yourself, either way, you're still living in his story. I'm just asking you, why don't you let him make the most of it? Let's pray.